Hi, hello, welcome back to the channel. It has been a while since I've done one of these sit-down vlogs, but this is going to be another one that goes on to the series of how I write my drafts. I thought it would just be a good idea to share how I do it in case it helps anyone. This video is going to be about how I write a third draft. The videos about how I write a first and second draft should be in this playlist as well. So I've got my laptop and I've got kind of like notes going so that I don't forget to say anything. So a quick little background. This is the second draft that I have made developmental edits to. Draft 2 was a complete and total overhaul of draft 1. I changed the love interest, I added a new character, I changed my main character's origin story. Complete and total overhaul, which just meant that whenever I wrote draft 3, I had a lot more changes to work with. Also for draft 2, I had 3 beta readers in total. So they read draft 2 and then I took their feedback in to make draft 3. Out of the 3 beta readers, 2 of them were writers and 1 of them was an avid fantasy reader. While they were reading draft 2, I left the draft alone for about 3 to 4 months and tried to not think about it as much as I could. While I was taking a break from book 1, I was working on the prequel because that would help me figure out a lot of stuff that happened since I changed my main character's origin story. It would help me figure out a lot of stuff that happened before book 1 even starts, to kind of figure out where my main character is, how she got there, why she is the way she is, all of that stuff. So, how I started the third draft. This is before I actually started writing it, but all of the stuff that I did to prepare. I printed out the draft and I read through it myself before I read any of my beta reader feedback. I wanted to have an opinion that was unaffected by feedback from my beta readers so that I knew what I thought of my book before I heard what anyone else thought of my book. And then I went in, after my first read through, I went in and I made a reverse outline of the draft, basically just writing everything that happened, basically an update of the draft 1 outline, but it was such a big change that I had to kind of basically rewrite it. After each chapter's outline, I would write my notes for my revisions that I wanted to make so that everything was kind of organized into the place where it needed to be when I would need it. So once I had read through it myself, made my reverse outline, and made all of my notes, I started digging into the beta reader feedback. And I relied heavily on color coding for this part. Each reader, including myself, had their own color. So on my printed copy of the draft, I highlighted and annotated everything, but then when I started looking at my beta reader's feedback, I went back into that same copy and based on that beta reader's color, I highlighted and annotated everything that they had mentioned. So essentially, I was trying to put everything into one place, so whenever I started writing the draft, I wouldn't have to go search for notes and then I wouldn't forget anything and that it could all kind of be in my field of vision at all times. And then, like I said, I had my reverse outline and under each chapter, I wrote notes for revisions, my notes for revisions. But once I had my beta readers feedback, I went back in and added their notes for revisions as well. And I also color coded this part. It made sense to me to color code. I feel like I cannot emphasize enough how helpful it was to color code everything. All of that took me about 2 or 3 weeks from reading it myself to adding in the beta readers notes because I worked like a maniac. Like I worked all the time around the clock trying to get all of these notes into the right place because I knew that this technically wasn't writing the draft for me, but it would help me eventually once I did start writing the draft. But I was really excited to start on the draft, so I was rushing through this part so that I could actually start writing it. So once that was done, I basically ended up with 4 documents that I was working with. The first one was the new blank document that I would write my third draft in. The second one was the outline plus the revision notes that I had for draft 2. The third was just the outline of the second draft. And the reason that I did 2 separate documents for the outline plus revisions and the outline is because the outline plus revisions document got very long. Like it had to be in its own folder. It was a lot of notes. So if at any point I wanted to reference the outline, it just became a lot to look through. So I printed out the outline without the notes, just so that if I needed to reference something really quickly, I would have that to look at and not have to sort through several pages of notes. And then the fourth and last document was the printed copy of the second draft that I had highlighted and annotated with all of my notes. And I kept that with me whenever I was writing. I would pull out the chapter I was working on from the binder and just look at that, so I wouldn't have to have a whole binder with me at all times and I wouldn't feel super overwhelmed to seeing the whole manuscript at the same time. But yeah, that's pretty much what I had when I started writing draft 3. Oh, and then the last thing I did before I actually started writing was I did a little bit of brainstorming for some of the developmental edits that I came up with or that my beta readers gave me, mostly for bigger stuff that required me to move things in the outline around. I didn't want to spend too long on this part, but I knew that I had to commit a little bit of time to it because I knew it would help me in the long run, because the story had changed so much. Like, I cannot emphasize how much of a total overhaul this was, but the story had changed so much that it required me to kind of look at the plot from a new perspective, and that required me to make some pretty big dev edits. And so I had to brainstorm so that I knew, or I had some idea of what I was doing to implement those edits. Even though I'm a pantser and I cannot outline or really brainstorm like for an outline, I knew that I had to do this if I didn't want to get stuck somewhere down the road. And with all of that, there are some things that I struggled with before I even actually started writing the third draft. Like I said, as a pantser, it's really hard for me to do outlines, and because I had to do some brainstorming before writing the draft, which is something that I'm not really accustomed to doing, it was a little bit harder. And with pantsing, in the past, I have usually worked with like a first draft or second draft, and I had a lot more freedom to kind of change things around, add characters, move entire plot lines over, and like there was no restriction on what I could and couldn't do. But with brainstorming for the third draft, I had a little bit more structure established in the story. I knew what was going to stay, what was going to go, so I had to kind of make pieces fit and work around what was already there instead of starting with a blank page, which in that sense, it was less intimidating because I wasn't starting with a completely blank document, but at the same time, it was just harder to make all of the stuff fit. And honestly, it didn't all fit yet. It still doesn't fit. I'm probably gonna have to work on making it fit a little bit more in the fourth draft, which is also going to be another developmental edits draft. But mostly it was just difficult because I was forced to think in a way that I had never done before. So finally starting the third draft. I started a blank document for this draft, but I knew that this was going to be the last draft that I started from scratch. When I say scratch, I mean from a blank document, instead of taking draft 2, making a copy, and then renaming it draft 3 and starting from there. Mostly because I wanted to have, I don't know really why, but it just made sense in my head that this draft had edits that were big enough that they required me to make a whole new document and go through each scene line by line to make sure that I was able to incorporate all of these new edits into every single paragraph. And if anything new came up, it would help me if I was typing instead of just passively reading it. The thing about actively copying things over and typing them by hand helps me question everything that I'm copying over, whereas if I had just made a copy of draft 2 and started there, I might have risked losing potential by passively reading through pages instead of actively typing them out. But draft 4 onward, I plan on just making a copy of the previous draft and then renaming it to the current draft. So like I said, I had the printed document in a binder, but whenever I was working on a chapter, I would pull out just that chapter, those pages from the binder, and keep that with me. Sometimes I would, if I knew I was not going to be at home, I would just take out those chapters and put them in the folder with the outline revisions document. That way I think it really helped to make it feel not so intimidating, because it was a daily reminder that I was taking it one chapter at a time. And then as I was writing up draft 3, I would just have draft 2 open on one side or have the printed copy with me. I would just copy over the words. I would actively type them out, so if I caught anything else or if I wanted to add something as I was writing, then I could. It was this weird middle space between coming up with the words yourself and writing them and copying them over, or copying your own words over, where I felt like I was editing and drafting at the same time, which was weird, but it worked. So anytime I would hit any annotation or highlight or note that I made in the printed document, I would stop and implement that into the draft the best I could at that moment. And then if I needed to do something bigger and it was like something I had to go and add, and later on I would make a note to do that. Usually I could just add it into the scene as I'm writing it, so I would do that and move on to the next thing. That's pretty much how I wrote the third draft. It was literally one edit at a time. Of course, the edits were more than just what I had annotated. I'll get into that. Essentially, that's what I did. That was like 90% of me writing draft 3. While I was writing the draft, I hit several walls, mostly because I had changed my characters so much that I almost didn't recognize them anymore. It was hard for me to imagine their new personality. I often had to call up one of my beta readers and ask them about a note that they made, or ask them for help in brainstorming something. Always kind enough to help me kind of get through this wall that I was hitting. Another thing that I did while I was writing, I did not focus on chapter structure or prose or grammar at all. Like grammar to some extent, not to make it a total mess, but prose and chapter structures, and honestly a little bit of characters too, because it was really hard to write these characters since I had changed them, but I didn't beat myself up over it because I had a plan to work on that in a later draft. So I made sure to make the focus of me writing this draft to be the developmental edits, and that kind of took a little bit of the weight off and allowed me to spend my energy focusing on implementing the dev edits instead. There are also some edits that I was really excited about kind of seeing come to life, so it was super rewarding to get to those edits and implement them into the draft. And of course, I had to make several new Pinterest boards to keep up with my new characters and their new personalities, and just trying to understand who they are, where they came from. And I also had to make new playlists, and sometimes if I was just stuck and if I just couldn't figure out my character, I would take a break and I would just scroll through their Pinterest board while listening to their playlist, and that actually helped me out a lot, because sometimes you need to just get into that headspace, and once you're there, it's a lot easier to figure out the character, maybe just for that scene specifically. But there were times when I had to like step away from the draft and do something else. Even when I did get something on the page, I wasn't always confident about what I had written, so it was a lot of just having faith in myself and my ability to be a writer. Speaking of faith, it took a lot of trust in myself as a writer to believe that whatever I was doing was right, or that I even knew what I was doing at all, especially on the days when I felt like I was a fraud in my own story. I felt imposter syndrome hard with this draft because I constantly was running into walls. I constantly was questioning my ability to write my own book. I was like, maybe there's somebody better out there who could write this book. And there might be, but I was the one who was writing it, and I had to keep going. I wanted to be careful to not let the edits change the heart of the story. It's so easy to come up with ideas for edits that could change and flip entire parts of your book, but you have to ask yourself if those edits are necessary, or if you're just bored, or if you're feeling insecure about your book. But it's easier said than done, because I was so close to the heart of the story that it was hard to have perspective and to even know if the edits that I was making were even working. And I felt like that was something that I would only know once the draft was done and I had taken some steps away from it for a while and looked back at it at a later time, which now that it is a later time, I can say yes, that the edits definitely worked and that they did make a big difference. And at some point I realized that this was actually the first draft with my characters' new personalities and backstories and all of that. All of those edits that I had made to draft 2 or wanted to make to draft 2, those were made in draft 3, but that was the first time that I had ever written those edits. And so it's almost like a first draft of those edits, if that makes sense. That's why I wanted to do another developmental edit draft, which is what draft 4 is, because I wanted to solidify that the first dev edits that I made and make sure that that they didn't seem rough or new or unpolished. It's hard, editing is really hard. I also wanted to give myself a little bit of grace because of that. It was also encouraging to tell myself I have another draft to revise these edits that I made, so it wasn't like I have to implement these edits perfectly or the book is gonna suck. Even though I'm about to start the 4th draft, I still feel like there's a lot more work to be done with the edits that I made in the 3rd draft. It is a never-ending process, and maybe I'll never be satisfied with it completely, but it's something that I have to take slowly. And lastly, as I was writing the 3rd draft, there were a lot of new edits that came to my attention, but I didn't want to overwhelm myself with trying to implement everything into this one draft. So instead of doing that and exhausting myself, I wrote them all down and saved them for a later draft, which is going to be the draft 4. Wanting to have beta readers was kind of a last minute decision that I made after I finished writing the draft, or mostly finished writing the draft, because I realized that this is kind of confusing, but draft 3 would be the last draft that I would make developmental edits on. So whenever I finished draft 3 and I started draft 4, the edits that I would make on draft 3 would make the draft 4, if that makes sense. So basically I realized that draft 4 is the last time I have a chance to make any fundamental changes to the story. So I wanted to get people's opinion on draft 3 so that if I missed anything in all of my drafts, then I could have it caught by another beta reader. But since I had used up all the beta readers that I knew in person, I had to turn to the internet to find strangers to read my book, which was really intimidating. Side note, once I realized that this would be the last time I would have beta readers or have anybody read this book until it was potentially published one day, was kind of terrifying. As much as I love the Bookstagram community, the idea of sending a complete stranger my manuscript was actually the most terrifying idea ever. So I made a Google form to see if any of the people on Bookstagram who were volunteering to beta read for me, if their reading taste matched my book. And I was lucky enough to have several responses, and a handful of them ended up being people that I had become friends with while being on Bookstagram. Even though I hadn't met them in person, I had been talking with them and we'd become friends. So it ended up working out really well. I ended up going with 4 beta readers. I thought that was a good number because it would allow me to compare their feedback, but there weren't so many that it would overwhelm me with the amount of feedback that I would get. So yeah, I thought that was kind of like the perfect number. For reference, like I said, I had 3 beta readers for the previous draft. This draft was definitely more of a challenge because I had no idea what I was doing. Like with previous drafts, I also had no idea what I was doing there, but it was easier to stumble through those than I guess it was with this because the book is slowly coming together and I don't want to mess up anything that's there and is good. I just don't want to revert any progress that I've made. I was basically figuring out my process as I was doing it. I learned a lot and it helped me prepare for a future 3rd draft I might have to write for another book. And in retrospect, I've definitely come to appreciate the process because yes, it has made my book better. It has made the book closer to the original vision that I've had for it for so long, which was really gratifying. I'm about to start the 4th draft here in a few weeks, and I'm just as scared and excited as I was when I was about to start the 3rd, because with every draft there is something new and a new challenge, a new promise, a new thing to look forward to. It's just, it never really ends. Hopefully it will end one day, but you know what I mean. And honestly, I still don't know what I'm doing. Not any more than I did when I started draft 3. But I know that I can do it because I did draft 3 and draft 2 and draft 1. And every time I thought I can't do this draft or I can't write this scene, I have done it. I have gotten over it and I have done it well, or to some extent that satisfies me. But yeah, that's pretty much how I wrote the 3rd draft. Again, it was not an easy experience, but it was very, very worth it. As I come up to this last draft with dev edits, I can really see the story's foundation taking place and making roots. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.